So I just want to welcome everybody to this, the very first Human Cell Atlas panel discussion on careers in science. I'm very excited about today's event. We have a really wonderful lineup of people doing incredibly interesting work, and I think this is going to be a really fascinating conversation as we learn about what they do in their careers and how they really arrive on their career path and get some pointers that all of you can take away from this meeting and hopefully apply to your future career goals. I want to start by saying that I myself actually owe my entire career path to an event just like this one that I attended when I was a postdoc at MIT. I attended a panel with a number of careers represented, including science policy, and the speaker on science policy happened to be from a local institution, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and she mentioned that they had an open fellowship that was actually closing the following week. But I managed to scramble and get my application together. I applied. I was very fortunate to receive the fellowship, and I spent the next 11 years of my career running science policy studies at the American Academy. That is actually how I became connected with the Human Cell Atlas, because one of our largest projects was on international collaboration in science. The Human Cell Atlas was one of our lead case studies as a really exemplary example of a large-scale grassroots scientific initiative and how that can be coordinated efficiently and productively. So when a position opened up with HCA, I again reached out to HCA to express interest, and that's how I ended up in my current position. So I say that really to illustrate 2 points, one of which is that that these careers are both rewarding and also available. There are openings in all these fields, but it is to some extent up to you to find those openings. And so I just always encourage people to reach out to anybody who is actively engaged in the career path that interests them. Just schedule, ask to schedule a short informational interview, take them out for coffee, whatever is the most convenient format to learn more. And that often will lead to further connections and even will alert you to openings in your career field. So that's one point that I want to make up front. And the other point is that we intentionally titled this panel discussion Careers in Science. All of us have PhDs, all of us have postdocs, but all of us, even though we are not actively doing research, we are actively involved with scientific research. We talk to scientific researchers every single day, and we give advice and we make decisions that really do impact the future of science week in and week out. And so these are, as I said before, extremely rewarding careers, and I hope that will come through. I'm sure that will come through in the panel discussion today. So without further ado, let me introduce the panelists, and we'll proceed to having a few short presentations from the panelists for the first half of our hour-long session, and then we'll reserve the second half hour for Q&A. I know we'll have a lot of questions, so I look forward to hearing your questions and to hearing the advice and the feedback from our panelists. I also want to say that the panelists have agreed to stay on for 15 or 20 minutes following the event. So beginning at noon Eastern time, we'll actually have some breakout rooms set up where you can chat sort of more informally with the presenters. We'll have one breakout room for science policy. Sarah Bowers will join that. We'll have one on publishing, and we'll have one on science philanthropy. And so that'll give you an additional opportunity to interact more directly with each of the speakers following the Q&A. So let me then move on to introducing our panelists. So we'll begin actually with Richard Paterson. So we have two editors from Nature with us. So Richard Paterson, is from Nature Communications, and he'll speak first, followed by his colleague Natalie Robot, who is Chief Life Sciences Editor at Nature and has been with Nature for well over a decade. We'll then hear from Sarah Bowers, who's the head of policy at the Wellcome Sanger Institute, hearing about science policy careers. And then finally, we'll hear about science philanthropy from Jonah Cool, a program officer at the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, and really one of the leading supporters of the entire Human Cell Atlas Initiative, and somebody that I've been very grateful to work with over my time with HCA. So I guess then without further ado, Richard, let's start with you, and then we'll just go through each of the speakers and then have some Q&A. Thank you very much.
Okay, great. So thank you, John, and thanks very much for the opportunity to be part of this event. It's great to be able to talk with you all, and I'm very much looking forward to it. So I work as an editor at Nature Communications, and I currently manage a team of professional editors handling papers in cell and developmental biology. So my personal career path is one that I'm sure will sound somewhat familiar to many people in the audience today. So I graduated university with a degree in plant biology, and I had a strong desire to have a career in science as a scientist, but without a really clear idea of what that meant. So as John was mentioning earlier, we all, I think everyone on this panel has a career in science. But at that time, the only scientists who I knew were the lecturers who had taught me during my undergrad. So I decided to stay at the University of Glasgow in Scotland, where I studied to do a PhD. And this was followed up by a postdoc at Cornell University in New York State. And in both cases, I worked on the topic of plant development, which is a topic which was and remains something of great interest to me and something I'm passionate about. And initially, when I started out as a postdoc, I was pretty sure that I wanted to be an academic. My ambition, like many new postdocs, I think, was to one day start up my own lab and research the stuff that I was interested in. So in my imagination, I would happily be doing experiments, writing grants, and most importantly, I'd be able to just have complete independence and do things exactly the way I wanted to do, and no more doing experiments that other people have thought up, no more being told what to do. So I thought this sounded great. But as the years went by, I began to become gradually less and less enthusiastic about this traditional career path, if you will. I wasn't really sure that working in a lab or becoming a PI was the job that I imagined it to be. And I wasn't sure if it was really the right job for me. So that was my position. And I was a little bit puzzled about where to go next. At the same time, I really did want to stay in science. I still really was passionate about my topic. I really loved discussing papers and experiments and talking about how things worked. And I was still super invested in the scientific questions of the field I was studying. And above all, I wanted a job that really made use of the scientific knowledge and critical thinking skills that I'd accumulated over the years I'd spent as a postdoc and as a PhD student. So one day I saw an advert for a job as an editor at Nature Publishing Group. And I must admit that before then, I'd never really thought too much about what a professional editor did. But I was lucky enough to get the job, and I've been at NatComs ever since. I've been here for around about 8 years now. So as a new editor, I was assigned a topic, which in my case was plant biology, and I handled all the new submissions in that area. And so what that means on a day-to-day basis is that I would get new papers, I would read them, I would discuss them with my teammates. I'd decide which ones were sent to peer review. I'd manage the peer review process and ultimately decide, as part of a team, which ones we were actually going to publish. So I think it's a really fun job, and in many ways, it has many of the same positives of being in the lab. So learning new stuff, discussing papers, problem solving as a team, with the big advantage that you're not tied down to a single project. And of course, we don't have to pipette or change rotors on centrifuges or anything like that. So there's also great satisfaction, I think, when I'm able to do my job well, because I realize that publishing and peer review is not always the most fun part of being a grad student or postdoc. So when we as editors can hopefully make that process as efficient and painless as possible, And when the end result is a strong paper that reaches the right audience, that does feel very rewarding. And so just recently, just a couple of months ago, I started a new role within the journal as a manager of a team of editors that handle the topics of cell and developmental biology. And one of the main reasons I'm here today is to advertise the fact that we have an opening at the moment for a new editor with an interest in single cell biology. And I think someone is going to post a link in the chat with some details on that. We'd be thrilled to hear from any of you who are maybe interested in that job or are interested in editorial careers more generally, because we are always on the lookout for talented editors.
Hello. I think Richard is frozen.
Oh, yep. Okay. And yes, so that's all from me. I'm happy to answer any questions that anybody might have.
I don't think we can hear you, John.
You're right. I said, let's move on to Natalie then, and then we'll hear from the other two speakers as well, and then we'll take questions after everybody is presented.
Yeah, that's great. Hello, I'm Natalie Robot. I also work at Nature Communications. I'm Chief Life Science Editor, which means that I oversee all the life science content and all the team of editors taking care of papers submitted to the journal in those areas. And I won't go back to when I was an undergraduate. I would just say that a little bit like Richard, I really enjoyed learning new things all the time. That is a part I enjoyed the most in all my career in laboratories. Especially, I was fortunate enough to be a PhD student at EMBL, and then I joined the Gordon Institute. And there are lots of different topics in link to cell and developmental biology. You could go to seminars. I really enjoyed doing that. At some point, I prefer doing this than problem solving my dirty PCRs, I would say. So that made me think, oh, what else could I be doing, not having a lab necessarily. And like John, I actually talked to somebody who was an editor at Science at the time in one of those career events in a conference. And it also happened that the person I worked first in the laboratory at the time was now an editor at Cell. So I contacted those people and tried to learn what they were doing. And I felt that it sounded really interesting in terms of being able to learn new things every day and not knowing what will land on your desk. Very exciting things, I thought. But at the time, I didn't think too much about the human aspects of the role, which is actually becoming the more important one over the years, which is, as an editor, you are able to help people at a very stressful time in their career when they submit the papers, and you are this point of contact between the reviewers and the authors. You are able to mediate any disagreements they have with reviewers, and you can really make a difference to how the paper will end up being published. And that really interests me the most, which I guess is why I then took on the role of taking care of editors as well in my current role. So as an editor, I actually work at Nature Cell Biology for 8 years and then at Nature for a number of years. And the one thing that John said, which is this is a role where you are very close to scientific research, is really true and thrilling. So I was fortunate enough to be at the inception meeting of the Human Cell Atlas, and this really became a project I thought was extremely interesting. And so as an editor at Nature, I was able to support the field as it was growing by taking care of those papers. And I hope that gave a good experience to people as far as I could do. One thing I also became passionate about during my career is that is reproducibility. And of course, reproducibility is not only in the hand of one stakeholder, it's in the hand of many stakeholders. But I do very strongly believe that publishers and editors can work to provide tools so that authors are able to explain everything, be as transparent as possible in their reporting, and so that then it is more reproducible, or people can really build upon them better. So because of a strong interest, I was involved over the years in developing the different aspects we have in terms of reporting guidelines. And in particular, this reporting summary that people have to fill in when they submit their papers to Nature Research, and this is really rewarding to me to look at papers that I would have taken care of at the very beginning of my career at NCB, and look at the paper now we will publish in Nature Communication, and how many more information there is in it that hopefully enables people to build upon it. So that's one thing I think I feel very passionate about, and there are many initiatives that we can participate as editors to support that. And another one, again linked to people, I guess, which I've been more involved in Nature Communication, is how to support early career researchers or postdocs. So at Nature Communications, we have this great program whereby we provide a webinar for early career researchers to learn about how to peer review a paper, and then we match early career researchers with an editor. They receive a paper and feedback on their review reports, and I think it's a great interaction to have in a safe space. On the real paper, editors may use those comments or may not, but it starts an interaction at that level, and perhaps even later on, the early career researcher have papers they want to submit, they know the editors more, or the editor can contact them to review other papers. So again, I go back to this initial thing, which was a surprise to me when I first become an editor. It's all about people, and that is really interesting. It's people doing scientific research and being who are passionate like you about progressing science and how we can improve, hopefully, things in life with that. So I don't think I will speak more, but I'm happy to take a question. I just wanted to give you an overview of other things you can do behind papers.
That's terrific. Thank you very much. And I see we already have a question related to becoming an editor, so we'll get back to that after
Yes.
from a couple more people. Let's turn to Sarian next to tell us about science policy. Sarian?
Thanks, John. Thank you for inviting me today as well. I'm really happy to be here to talk about my career. So I think the start of my career is quite a lot like Richard's and Natalie. I started off at university doing an undergraduate in biochemistry, and I was enjoying myself. I have to admit, I didn't really know what a PhD was, and this is a terrible reason for doing a PhD, but I kind of figured I liked what I was doing. Maybe I'd continue it. But anyway, I did get into a PhD program, and my PhD supervisor was someone who was actually very senior, and she was doing a lot of sort of policy activity on the side of her work. And so I do have to apologise, there's an almighty storm, so I apologise if everybody can hear the thunder. Yeah, it's sort of slightly apocalyptic outside at the moment. So my PhD supervisor was doing a lot of policy work. She was involved in lots of interesting initiatives. She was on the board of governors for the Wellcome Trust. She was on the board of the British Museums. And this sort of seemed quite interesting to me, and this sort of idea that as a scientist you could kind of be much more involved in sort of things with societal impact. And so again, still not really knowing what I wanted to do, I had this vague idea that I would just do what she did and, do some postdocs and then become a PI and do some policy on the side. So I did a postdoc in Leeds, which I actually loved. I had great fun there, but I didn't actually love the science so much. I really enjoyed working with the people. Then I went to the University of Connecticut, which was an interesting life choice. And I finally, I was pretty slow off the mark, I guess, but I finally realized that I actually really didn't like being in the lab, and that instead of wanting to be a group leader who did policy on the side, I should actually just go do policy. So I went from there. I went to go and do a master's in science and technology policy at the University of Sussex, which has a well-established science policy research unit. And actually, I had an absolute ball that year. The majority of the degree was sociology, which is something that I hadn't really ever explored before. It completely changed my way of thinking about things. It transformed the way I kind of relate science to society. I thoroughly recommend every scientist get a grounding in kind of sociology of science and think about these things. And then it was a sort of slightly stars aligning moment that I had to do a dissertation as part of my master's degree. I didn't really like any of the dissertation topics that were on offer, so I suggested my own dissertation, which was on implementation of genomics into the NHS, which I had no genomics background. I was a biochemist and worked on chromatin, but this was a big technology that I knew was really coming into its own in healthcare, and I wanted to write about it. So I did, and then a job came up doing policy at the Sanger Institute, and I applied for it, and somewhat to my surprise, I got it. I will admit I was probably slightly naive and didn't maybe ask all of the questions I should have. I had imagined there was a policy team at the Sanger Institute, and I turned up to discover I was the policy team. And in fact, the person who had decided that Sanger should have a policy function had actually left in the interim between me getting the job and me starting the job. So I've spent the last 7 years figuring out what a policy team at Sanger might look like, and I've taken it from me being in a relatively junior role to a much more senior role, and I now have a small team underneath me. We work on a very diverse range of topics, which is wonderful. So I think we each have our own specialism. I have ended up learning a lot about data, so particularly data protection, which I never thought I would be an expert on GDPR, and that is how I've actually ended up knowing John, doing work on GDPR and HCA. And then my team are working on everything from open science to equity in collaborations with low-middle countries, research culture, data sharing. We are looking. I have one person who's looking at diversity in data and ethnicity at the moment, genetic discrimination, and we're about to start a project on synthetic genomics. So it's a really broad range of issues. No day is ever the same. I absolutely love that I get to work on such a broad range of topics, and that I have to learn about new things pretty much every day, which I probably never really did in the lab. And actually, I think in some ways my job is more mentally difficult than when I was in the lab. And again, I enjoy that aspect of it. So I'll probably leave it there for now, and I'll hand over to John. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Saran. And we'll turn now to Jonah.
Great. Hello, you can hear me okay? Yep, perfect. Okay, so my name is Jonah Cool. As John mentioned, I am a science officer at the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative. The Chan Zuckerberg Initiative is a relatively young philanthropy, so now about 5.5 years old, and I've been at CCI for 5 years. My background may be similar to Richard and Natalie and Sarian, has taken a number of different turns. The one thing that may be a bit different with me is I really had no intention of pursuing a career in science. So for many years, the thing that really captivated me in the area that I worked in was innovation and intellectual property. And that was kind of the avenue into science. So I had worked as a paralegal and had thought that I would go to law school all through university and even for a period of time after that. And it was kind of science as a domain that fascinated me, and appreciating a lot of the IP and cases that I had seen were very, very early stage as compared to other domains of technology. And fortunately, I had been an undergraduate biology pre-med major just kind of by happenstance and again by curiosity. So my PhD is in cell and developmental biology and really focused on quantitative genetics as well as imaging and microscopy in the early embryo. Went on to continue that in a postdoc. And then after my postdoc, made the decision to go into biotech and spent a number of years in smaller, startup company and working on different questions, really kind of the inverse question that I was trained in. So instead of thinking about how cell types are specified and then come together to form physiologically distinct organs, was working in tissue engineering and thinking about how to take fully mature human cell types and recombine them, pattern them, in many cases, bioprint them into mature organs for implantation or for experimentation. So in thinking about aspects of my career progression, and then maybe also thinking a bit about the leap that really I think I made coming from biotech to CZI a couple years ago. The big question for me when I left biotech was the question of, was I ready and excited to move away from the bench? And I had already done that to some extent, as the group that I led there was about 10 to 15 people after a number of years. And so I was spending more and more time thinking about the science in the group as opposed to doing my own work. And I think this is maybe one bit of advice that I would give that's certainly true of a career in philanthropy and science funding, but I think I heard this from all of the others as well, is that to really learn to love science, but in particular, the science of others. And, really kind of thinking about and appreciating the nuances of that, getting into it, getting excited by it, and thinking about how to support it. Very, very, very true of a role as a program officer, but I think also kind of more broadly, generally true. Maybe another couple of things that are themes perhaps throughout my career and helped me think about that transition at a couple different stages, really. So one is I've always really loved collaboration. And I think this again comes back to intellectual property and maybe perhaps the second theme in my career, which is a real affinity and love for innovation and creativity. And just the observation and personal experience that I've always felt the most innovative and the most creative, or seen the most innovative and creative ideas in situations in which there's interesting, different collaborative teams and kind of intersections of skill sets. For me, many of those collaborations that I was most fascinated and excited by often came at the intersection of technology and engineering and science. And again, this is kind of a theme that's followed me throughout my career, both in my PhD, where we were doing a lot of quantitative biology and different genomics assays and analysis and statistics, into my postdoc, where it was more cell engineering, and then finally in biotech, where we were doing a lot of mechanical, electrical, and software engineering. And now within the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, the group that I lead includes teams of software engineers and product managers. And so we're both thinking about how to fund the work within the Human Cell Atlas and single cell biology, but also build technology solutions that supports all of that work. Okay, so then the final bit of advice, because I think that was one prompt that we talked about, is just to ask a lot of questions. This was something that was really, really helpful for me, certainly during my postdoc, when I knew that it was kind of time for me to move on. And there were some jobs out there that I thought that I may be interested in, and trying to find people that were in those jobs and ask them what the job really was, and to try to decompose it and understand what the component parts are and how excited I was about them. Interview for a few of them. As I look back, going through some of those interview processes and realizing that certain things are as they appear and really exciting, other things are not and were not exciting for me. Glad that others do it. But really trying to get to that kind of first step of what you really love and kind of generates that excitement. Okay, with that, again, maybe thank John and Christine and Tracy and the HCA team for the invitation. This is really fun. Appreciate it.
Well, thank you to all of you. These have been really terrific opening comments. I think really helpful for framing the remainder of the discussion. So we will have about 30 minutes now for Q&A here before we move into breakout rooms. We've had a number of questions in the chat already. Just a reminder that if you do have a question, please click the question mark and type your question in, and you can indicate whether you want to remain anonymous or not. I'm going to begin because there are a few questions specifically directed to editing and scientific publishing that have been at least partially answered already in the chat. But I want to begin by inviting Natalie and Richard to expand on those answers, and then I'm actually going to, they can be sort of broadly generalizable. So I'll also ask Jonah and Sarah to answer similar questions. So first, I guess, can we address this question of translational skills, which always comes up in these types of conversations? What skills actually translate from being a researcher to being a scientific editor, for example? And Sarah and Jonah, you can answer this as well from your standpoints. And simultaneously, I'd ask you to also address this question about qualifications. How advantageous is it to have a postdoc? Is there other experience that is really beneficial if you're interested in pursuing a career as an editor? And then there's also a question here about specialization, I guess I would say. And for example, if you're interested in plant bioinformatics, should you really be looking for journals in that field, or as you yourselves demonstrated, should you look more broadly at other journals? So that's a set of questions. Let me ask Natalie and Richard to address this first, and then I'll turn to Jonah and Saria.
Richard, how you want to do this? I want to take the last one about somebody asking if they should specialize in their bioinformaticians and interested into going into journals. You are very hot property at this moment in time if you are such a person, because that's a field that has been exploding, and many journals are looking for hiring at that level. And I don't think it matters if you are specializing in what particular topic of bioinformatics or not, because one of the key thing of being an editor is that you come with one area of expertise and you just expand from there. But your skills, as Richard mentioned, your analytical skills are very important, and that's what is going to help you assess papers first in your own area, and then grow up and from there. I would guess is a thing. So analytical skills definitely is a transferable skill to have.
Yeah, I mean, I remember finishing my postdoc and thinking, well, my skills are Western blot and qPCR and sequencing, but I think a lot of us underestimate how transferable our skills are, and so really. I think, yes, the critical thinking, knowing how to read a scientific paper means that you become good at being able to find the meaning in sometimes complex data, and identify shortcomings, identify areas of potential. A postdoc is not an absolute requirement for an editorial job. It's an advantage. Most of the editors at Nature Communications have postdocs, but not all of them. So I would say if you're interested, but you just have your PhD, but not a postdoc, don't be put off from applying. Yeah, and I think that we are looking for people who have experience of the publication process. So if you can show that, if you've had a few, say, first author papers, that's definitely something we're looking for. Any other sort of interactions with the peer review process, maybe as a reviewer, maybe as a guest editor at a certain journal, maybe if you've assisted, maybe if your PI is an academic editor for a journal and you've helped out there, that kind of thing is beneficial.
And so the one thing that I think it's related to another question, which is in the chat too, about mainly boiling down to the distinction between referee and editor. So what the editor needs to be able to do is to place the findings presented in the paper in the context of the current literature, or things they know people are interested in, that they have learned about by going to meetings. But they don't have to be able to assess the technical aspects of each experiment. That is the role of the reviewer, so to speak. Of course, because you read a lot of papers and you hear about a lot of research projects, you know what to expect in a paper in terms of the narrative and what types of experiment will be presented on the basis of the research questions. But you don't really sort of assess the quality of this. So that's why you can sort of branch out to other things just by talking to people, learning, and also learning a lot from reading reviewers' reports as well. So another transferable skill, I guess it's a little bit linked to what Jonah said, which I think is very true, is that you have to be excited by other people's science, because it's not your science anymore. You become a carer, and this has to be quite exciting for you, that you're going to be a carer for many people. and make a difference to many people, but at the end you work a little bit behind the scene. Your name is not attached to all of the paper. You take pride in seeing the finished product, that the paper is better, or you've been able to help a particular field to take off by doing a good job by finding the right reviewer for the papers as well. So that's quite important. It's a behind the scene job, I would say.
Terrific. I want to turn to Saren and Jonah, but actually first I want to press you a little bit on this question of specialization. Albrecht Froelich is pointing out that many job postings actually do have a sort of topical focus to them. How should prospective applicants in any field, and this goes for the other fields as well, interpret that kind of a focus? Is it sort of a nice to have in the eyes of the employer, or should they really just disregard anything that doesn't have their scientific specialty in it?
Well, I think in many journals, I think Nature Communications is perhaps a little bit of an exception, that we have a lot of editors at Nature Communications, so we are each quite specialized. But for many journals, they will be looking, many journals within Nature research and more broadly will have a handful of editors which are covering a very wide topic area. Mm-hmm. So I wouldn't be put off from the career too much if your particular experience doesn't match exactly what's in the advert. Sometimes we are looking for somebody with a specific area of expertise. But I would say in general, we have a degree of flexibility.
I would jump in quickly on this one and echo that as well. And maybe also just kind of taking my science philanthropy hat on and putting my biotech hat on and thinking about and remembering writing jobs there. You often write these job descriptions to be very, very specific, and maybe even like acknowledging that you're writing kind of a unicorn job description. And so if you look at something and think like, oh God, I've got 8 of the 10, but I'm missing these 2, but I think I could really do this job. You should apply if you're excited about it. Don't let those 2 things, or maybe even a little bit more, to dissuade you. And you may get some feedback, or maybe could also reach out. But I think oftentimes, there's a very, very specific mindset, and it's okay to apply and encourage to apply. Mm-hmm. Maybe the one other thing that, and just to go back to, I think the question that I heard about, and there were 2 things that I wrote down. One is kind of the specific transferable skills, and the other is a postdoc. Maybe just to add, I think, as I mentioned, I did do a postdoc. I found that experience to be very, very helpful and really great for me. And I think the big thing was the opportunity to really initiate and lead my own research project. Not to say that I didn't have that agency as a graduate student, but it's just a different experience. And I think that's really important. And one of the reasons it's important is, I think, as a PhD, when you go into any of these careers, the thing that is often expected of you is leadership, and being able to think about questions and think about the right questions. And, as a postdoc for, a number of years, I think it is a really great opportunity to really hone those skills and sharpen them. Does everyone need to do it? Definitely not. But I think it is something, if, Richard put this nice, it's perhaps an advantage and kind of a demonstration, and, fellowships or publication kind of demonstrate that ability. So I think that leadership and asking the right questions, and then the other thing that I think is very true of scientists that sometimes we don't always appreciate because we're surrounded by other scientists, is the analytical capabilities that we kind of innately are trained with that many other fields don't necessarily have. And, I've gained more and more exposure to technology and software engineering and things like that. And those skills that are trained in science are really useful in areas like product development or user research or editing or grantsman, all sorts of different areas. It's different than the Western blotting or like very specific technical skills that people may think are important, but is critical.
Saren, that's actually a really great lead-in to ask you a related question, both about transferable skills, but also about the specialized master's programs. This is a question that I often get, is whether it's journalism, public policy, public administration. What are the pros and cons of taking that route to a career, and what did you gain from that experience?
So I would say I don't think you need a master's to do this job. And so in my team at the moment, I have two people who came straight from a PhD, both from STEM PhDs, neither genomics, I have to say, and then one person who has a master's in law, and so she has a legal background. And so I do think these kind of masters are fantastic. I loved mine. It was honestly probably one of the best years of my life. And they are good for helping you pick up get new kind of views on things and understand things differently. I think particularly, thinking about the UK education system where it's very, very narrow and deep. So scientists who come out of an undergraduate, a 3 or 4 year undergraduate in the UK will have, effectively postgraduate level knowledge in the US, but they don't have any of the other, they haven't done anything other than that very specialized degree. And I think that can be, I think a master's can be quite good for bringing in a different perspective. But as I said, I don't think you need it. So you did ask a second question. Was it about the skills you pick up? Yes. I think it depends what masters you do. Some of them will have very specific skills associated with them. But I think many of them, it's more about developing a broader perspective on the subject. I guess if I was going to sort of slightly flip the skills question round and maybe say what's missing, I think that, certainly my own experience, and I've seen this with other people, is it can be quite difficult transitioning to the sort of office environment and realizing that when you come out of the lab, in the lab, everybody actually has very similar goals. They're often actually very similar age groups. It's very stratified, PhD students are early 20s, postdocs are kind of late 20s, early 30s, PIs are, well, anything. And you're all working in very, very similar ways with very similar goals. Even if it's not your ultimate life goal, you're still trying to write, get results, get a paper, all the rest of it. And now suddenly you're in an office with people who have all sorts of things that they're working on, different priorities, different motivations, and actually learning to sort of engage with that and interact with that, and actually how you can persuade people. And also I completely agree about the analytical point, but actually sometimes you have to tone it down a little bit, because obviously, sitting there in a team meeting where someone shows a graph, that is not the moment in which to ask how exactly they picked that y-axis. So, there is an adjustment, I think, that has to be made. And I'm not saying scientists can't make it, but that is probably the bit that might be missing from our backgrounds. I see a lot of smiles. I think we've all been there. So, but yeah.
That's a terrific point. We have a great question in the chat that I'd like to actually ask of each of you, which is, what are some other career paths that are related to each of your professions in policy and publishing and in philanthropy that maybe people aren't thinking about and that they should also be considering? And what are the other opportunities? Maybe going back to Richard and Natalie to start with that, and then we'll hear about the other fields.
Yeah, I mean, so one career which I've often thought is somewhat related to editorial is working for funding agencies in terms of, helping to program managers for the NIH or something like that, and deciding how to prioritize grant applications, that kind of thing. I think that's sort of related. Within publishing itself, I should point out that, I mean, we are part of a big multinational company. I mean, we at Nature Communications have a particular way of working, but there's a wide variety of different careers. I mean, the company publishes Scientific American, for example. We have journalists there, we have press officers, we have people who are experts on production and work on art designers, all that kind of thing. So there's quite a lot of related careers, I think, there.
Sure. And Jonah, Sarian, any thoughts on that?
You want to go first, Erin?
Sure. I'm just actually, no, you go first, Jonah. I'm marshalling my thoughts.
Sure. So maybe one thing just to verify is indeed in a funding agency, we have a few people that have come from editing and publication. So I agree with Richard on that one. Career options from philanthropy and science funding, I would say there's kind of two big things that come to mind, but a third category that's maybe a little specific to CCA. So one is other funding mechanisms. So certainly there are folks that I know that have gone on to areas like venture capital and work like this. So similarly thinking about how to support science, very different drivers than in science philanthropy and trying to support academic science, but thinking about it through commercial means. That's one. The other is going back to research institutions and within philanthropy, thinking a lot about not just the certain projects, but how to support and create systems and structures that help advance science. And so opportunities to go back to research institutes or universities or things like that and work in more administrative roles. And have indeed seen a few folks that have done that. And then the third, and maybe this is a little bit related to some of the analytical capabilities, but a few friends and colleagues have gone into kind of left formal science and gone into technology in different areas. And again, thinking about product development and or user research, in some cases with cognitive science, there's a lot of really, really fascinating and interesting work in user design and experience.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I guess for policy, the common cousins of policy are probably comms and public engagement. So you often see those teams together, although I have to say they're not at Sanger. And those are jobs that, there can be a bit of a blur actually between the boundaries of those. And so I think having, particularly for communications, I think having the scientific background is almost required for it. I guess if I was thinking about what career would I do if I hadn't done policy, as part of my master's, I did actually do I did do a module on intellectual property law, which was fascinating. It was something I knew nothing about, and then since starting at Sanger, I've seen the work of our technology translation team, and actually I think that's a really interesting career of how do you take products from the lab all the way through to commercialization. And that's not a trivial matter, and people often are quite simplistic about it, and it's, I think, a very interesting, complex field, and having a scientific background for that is really useful. So that's probably where I would go if it wasn't policy.
I think Richard covered most of the things, but one thing that I didn't mention is that when I was trying to find what else to do, if not running a lab, I did a diploma in science communication. And naively, I thought what I would really enjoy doing will be preparing museum exhibit. This diploma, what it did teach me is things I didn't want to do, which is going very far away from all the things I've learned, really in-depth analytical skills, a lot about different scientific fields. This was completely different to what I expected. Basically, it was much more at the level of trying to the entertainment business, I would say, more than the science business. And that taught me that I didn't want to do this. So it's good to explore, if you have the time, other avenue by taking on those courses.
I totally agree with you, Natalie. I had a few of these experiences as well. And maybe this is back to one of those points of advice that I would encourage people. And I think sometimes it feels a little bit awkward coming from academic labs, but go through some of those interview processes. Don't feel bad about interviewing and getting a sense for a job and seeing if the fit is right. And if it's not right, saying no, right? Like that's okay. Handle yourself well, et cetera. But I had the same experience where there were a few things that I thought I was really excited about and applied. A couple of the places I applied to, was fortunate enough to get an interview, and by the end thought, there is no way I'm going to do this job, right? Like there's no science, there's no this or that, but like that, it's a great process. It can take a lot of time, and there's definitely like a kind of emotional output with that, but I think incredibly useful and informative to get a sense, in addition to talking with people that are doing the job, to kind of like put yourself in the position and ask that question of, would I be excited to do this or not? And there's some surprises in there that are really helpful.
Absolutely. Let me just, I guess we have a few minutes left before we move to breakout groups. Let me just ask the panel if there's any advice that you have for people exploring careers, or even just advice in terms of how to make themselves the strongest possible candidate for your fields that hasn't really been brought up yet.
I would say for us, read outside your field. Read outside your field, go to seminars, exciting person in another field you have only seen in nature, or science or cell or anything, but never read the paper. If the person is coming, go and listen. Just to get an idea of all the different things that people are doing, I would say. That would be maybe Richard has another idea, but I think.
Yeah, I mean, I fully agree with that. I think also speak to the PIs, lecturers in your department. Maybe some of them are on editorial boards of academic journals. Maybe there's an opportunity to help out. Maybe there's an opportunity to peer review. Sign up for our early career reviewer program.
Yeah.
Just get as much, if it's something you're interested in, get as much experience of the process as you can from whichever angle you can. Yeah.
So I guess for policy, policy is a competitive field. It's a popular career choice for people. I don't think you do need experience in policy in order to get into it. I think, though, you do need to have the right attitude. And so reading up around policy and really understanding it is critical. I do run a policy course that I set up a few years ago, and it's interesting because, a lot of scientists, and I probably could count myself in this category back in the day, believe that, they really strongly feel that if you just build the scientific evidence, policy will follow. And that's really obviously not the case. And so understanding how policy works and, this interplay between evidence and values and society is really critical. And I think it's one of the things that when you see it in a cover letter, when someone just sort of says, well, just follow the science or something similar to that, that's pretty much no. I think the other piece of advice that I would give, it sounds very basic, but having recruited a lot, people don't do this. Tailor your cover letter, do everything that the job, when the job, the advert requires certain documents, include them. The number of people who think they can just send a CV and will, magically infer all of the information from that is quite surprising.
Yeah, I would second that. We read every cover letter. Absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, for me, the cover letter is almost more important often with the kind of jobs that I'm recruiting for than the CV. So.
Yes. Jonah, any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, not a lot to add. Maybe just to emphasize a few things that I've mentioned, and I think I just heard the others mention as well. So again, just this point of really loving science, and in particular that of others, I think is critical, and just kind of getting into those different fields, thinking about what's unique and interesting, how it relates to your own, and kind of pushing to think about science in a larger, broader context, and where are the areas that people are struggling with, what are the holes, what are the policy implications, I think is really helpful for any of these careers and many others. And then, maybe on this point of CVs and cover letters, really thinking about why a particular career path or job excites you and communicating that. And I agree, the cover letter is usually where that comes out, why someone is applying to this job as opposed to a whole bunch of jobs. And that's really important, both for, asking of yourself, but also then communicating that clearly and kind of demonstrating that.
Great, thank you. And in the last few minutes, I actually want to ask a very different question of all of you, which is really about work-life balance. This is a question that I get a lot from for people who are either concerned about the demands of a new career, or just sort of uncertain about it, or they're actually looking for sort of perceived relief from being in the lab 24/7. And so I just want to ask each of you for your perspective on that. Again, maybe we'll go back to Richard and Natalie first, and then starting in Jonah.
Yeah, so I think I'm fortunate to work for a company and a boss in Natalie, who is very supportive of me having a good work-life balance. It's a very different pace of work, working in editorial as opposed to working as a postdoc, at least in my experience as a postdoc. I didn't get too much day-to-day direction of people telling me which experiments to do when. I know that is different for some people. And if I messed up and did the complete wrong thing for 2 weeks, then it would be on me. It would be my own time lost. Whereas in editorial, if I do that, then I get the external pressure from authors asking me what's going on with their paper and that kind of thing. So it is high-paced. There is pressure, but I feel the company does really support us to handle that, and I do feel like I'm able to have a good work-life balance. There's no pressure to work on weekends. There's no pressure to work at 9 o'clock at night, like I know that sometimes there is in some labs. Not all labs, I'm sure, but some.
Others, Jonah?
I just add one thing that I think Richard was alluding upon. So I think definitely it's you work a lot and you're not. Also, the one thing which is a little bit negative, but it's to consider, is that you're not the master of your own time. So papers will come no matter the time of the year. That said, you don't have to attend to them immediately. You can, come Friday, you switch off the computer and you can forget about them until Monday. And we hope also understand this, but definitely at the level of the company, it is understood that this would be the case.
Yes, I'm happy to go next. So I think in general within science funding and philanthropy, the work-life balance is quite good. There is a lot of work, and I think it looks a little bit different. So the schedule and cadence. I would say over the last few years, this is true of CZI as a young organization, and also true of my experience in biotech startups. That in that startup environment, the work-life balance is kind of erratic, right? You're kind of working against deadlines, or trying to get products out, or doing things for the first time, and that often creates these peaks of really intense, very exciting work. I think it can be really, really fun, and as kind of a collaborative thing, energizing, but also maybe very different than working for larger established companies where there's less of those peaks and valleys. Not that they don't exist. And so I think that this is also a very, very good thing to get a sense for, because different organizations will have very different cultures around aspects of this. And I've frankly have seen our culture kind of like shift and evolve and grow in that way. And so I think it's grown into a much more kind of deliberate, equal work-life balance. But sometimes young companies have to work through that, and is not always there from the get-go.
Yes, I guess so. Samuel, I have to say, does spend a significant amount of time trying to thinking about staff welfare. So I definitely do not work particularly long hours. Actually, as a PhD student, I was working 80 to 100 hours a week, and I burnt out. And I have since been very careful about that kind of thing. I have no desire to ever do that again. I don't work 9 to 5, though. I would say one of the things about this job is that it does involve quite a lot of travel. It also involves quite a lot of international work, which means time zones, which does mean calls at odd hours. I generally try to avoid anything after 8 p.m. because as I've got into my 40s, I've decided to fall asleep after 8 p.m. in meetings, so it's generally not a good look. But I am a bit more of a morning person, so I will do early morning calls sometimes, but I try to reclaim the time back, and certainly within my team. So one of my team is actually primarily for the Global Alliance for Genomics and Health. This means a lot of calls at odd hours, and I'm quite strict that she takes that time back out of her workday. So it's not just adding hours onto an already busy day. I would say the work is in peaks and troughs. Again, things have a habit of clumping together. I was in Berlin for my first work trip last week since the pandemic, and then had a big roundtable that we'd organised yesterday. So it was a little bit of a shock, having spent a week in Berlin, having not travelled for 2 years. And then yesterday I had to go into a roundtable on something completely different from what I'd spent the previous week working on. And that's kind of the life of being the head of policy. I have to flip between many different subjects, and that's actually probably the bit that I find tiring rather than the hours, is actually just the sheer number of things I have to be on top of. So I'll probably leave it there.
Sure, thank you. Well, this has really been terrific. I want to thank all of our panelists, and as well as the my colleagues in the HCA Executive Office for helping put this together. Just close with a couple of slides, and then we'll move to breakout groups. So I want to take this opportunity, as I always do, to encourage anybody who is not currently an HCA member to join our membership. HCA is an open community. We're open to anyone who supports our mission and values, and you can sign up at humancellatlas.org/joinhca. I also want to highlight some upcoming events. I should also mention the biological networks as well, which is another way to get involved in the HCA community, and those are shown there on the right. So you can also sign up for those as well. Sorry, Christine. Moving on to events then, we have a few upcoming events. We have a regular seminar series featuring the biological networks. The last one before our summer break will be on June 9th, featuring the kidney network. We're also looking forward to our annual general meeting, which is at the end of June. It is a hybrid meeting. The physical portion will take place in Vienna. Similarly, we have hybrid meetings for our HCA Asia network in Bangkok in November, and our developmental and pediatric cell atlas group in Paris, France, also in November. So please stay tuned for more information about registering for those events. So we'll go to breakout groups now. I'll ask my colleagues to put the link in the chat as well. If you click on that link, then you will be able to join breakout groups specializing in policy, publishing, and philanthropy. We'll have about another 15 minutes to converse with our speakers, and then we'll close the session entirely for those of you who can stay. So thank you again. Thank you to the attendees, to the speakers, and my colleagues, and we look forward to the discussions in the breakouts. Thanks.